I'd like to thank Mr. Barry, Mr. Allen, Vice Chairman Graves for those wonderful presentations. They really set context. We're going to move right into the next topic, but I do want to stop for just a second to see if any of the members of the task force seated up front have any questions for any of the presenters.
Madam Chair, not a question, but just a comment. So much incredible, important information by three certainly distinguished and knowledgeable people. May we have a copy of their comments and their PowerPoint? Lots of facts and figures I'd like to digest a little bit more.
Absolutely. Good suggestion. Of course you can. And I will just remind everyone that every state's going to get their chance. So we recognize that every state has similar, but maybe some different issues as well. But it is part of our reason for being here, instead of in Washington or our respective state capitals, is to hear from the people here what has already been identified as challenges and opportunity. And I think our three speakers did a wonderful job of doing that. We now turn to Brian Griffith. Many of you know Brian as head of the Gulf Coast Alliance. We have gently borrowed him, probably permanently, to serve as the Deputy Director of the Gulf Coast Restoration Task Force staff. And Brian is going to walk us through the structure, schedule, and progress in terms of moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, we are back on time. I want to thank the presenters previously for getting us there. It's also an awesome prospect to follow John Barry, Charles Allen, and Garrett Graves as the next speaker, but I'll give it my best shot. I want to thank both the chairs and the members for giving us an opportunity. I'm actually going to represent the voice of the larger staff, your executive staff that's been working for the last few months to prepare for this meeting and prepare a schema, if you will, to move ahead with the task that's before the task force, and that's the preparation of an effective and stakeholder-driven strategy for progress, the very progress that was referenced numerous times in the previous presenters' presentations. I'll move right in. This is as high as the stakes can get. I think the previous presenters more than overwhelmed the situation and informed the dialogue there. This is a process that we must get right because, again, the stakes are so very, very high for both the region and the nation. So it is a national treasure of unprecedented consequence, and it is America's sea. Looking specifically to the executive order for our guidance at the staff level, we bore in to many of the aspects that were presented in that particular guidance, and we focus once again on the President's acknowledgement of what a national treasure that we are dealing with. And frankly, we'll get into a little bit in the work planning structure, just what that means in terms of stepping up to the plate and doing something just a little different than has been in the past. One of the things I would actually ask your indulgence on is to point out even the presenters, as they did such a marvelous job, they moved back and forth in the dialogue between restoration and largely on an ecosystem scale, and largely that level of effort that is going on to recover specifically from the Deepwater Horizon incident. So as your staff has been working on this particular puzzle for you, we engage that confusion a little bit daily. And I want to try to put a perspective out there for you and get your concurrence, of course, in your guidance as to how to best help in this particular respect broadly. You'll note that the executive order specifies specifically the Deepwater Horizon event and then moves into addressing long-standing ecological decline. Of course, for those of us that do this as a daily walk of our life, we know those are two distinctly, largely, but not exclusively separable incidences, that being one an incident and the other being the occasioned effect of a long-standing level of decline, notwithstanding notably the level of land loss right here in southeast Louisiana or Louisiana proper. So I'm going to take just a moment of time to try to give you a reflection on how I think we ought to begin to collectively address this confusion. There are two pieces of work at play here simultaneously in the legislative and the executive branch. First, in incident recovery, and this would be virtually any incident that would affect the Oil Spill Pollution Act incident that we in the nation have come to know as the Deepwater Horizon, or in many circles just DWH. You see it almost on all of the correspondence. But it is an incident of specific time, scale, and value. On the executive side of the House is, of course, Executive Order 13554, the President's executive order signed into effect on October the 5th. This is where we're focused on ecosystem restoration. And I'm going to try to bridge the two, and there is a reason that the line connects it, because there is a bridge between the two, but they are in two worlds. On the incident recovery side, and by the way, just before I get away from this, I think you can appreciate from John Barry's presentation, this is what the view of the Gulf would look like if we drained the water out of it. And if you look just to basically the southeast of New Orleans in the slide, you see those fingers, that more or less that mountain range that cascades off of the continental shelf. That was the previous deposits of the upper Midwest delivery of sediments, and actually is still ongoing, of course. But those are just archaeological evidences of how the river worked. I'd also point out, if we have anybody in here from Iowa, Nebraska, etc., they probably have a land claim out there, but that's related. The Deepwater Horizon spill response that we're also focused on is just a couple of months away from or many of us were focused on a couple months away from the anniversary. Again, was the effect of an incident to actually turn the Oil Spill Pollution Act processes on. And centered around that incident was and still is a lot of ongoing activity to clean up and to deal with the specific first task of the emergency response: cap the well, get the exposure under control. The second feature of that within that structure is what the world has started to refer to, and I will try not to do that. I'll try not to use the acronym, but rather the title line is the Natural Resources Damage Assessment. And just precisely what that term means is, what are the damages associated with the Deepwater Horizon spill incident, the event itself? And that is an ongoing proposition and process that is taking place among all of the trustees' council. In effect, of course, it is to look at the damages that are or have occurred or will occur as a result of that spill. Be they the inundation here, this is actually just, I believe this is Blackman's Parish, to the impact on the living marine system, to the impact on waterfowl, and the impacts and the impacts and the impacts, and notice the slide could go on. This is where the process is looking and mining in to find out exactly what that remedial recovery process is going to be. And then the last feature of this, but far away from the last in a matter of importance, you, Madam Chair, and several of the presenters noted that just a few days of shutting the river down, much less the months that have waned after the Deepwater Horizon event, have had and continue to have a significant economic impact on this region at a very time when the nation is already under economic issues nationwide. It's exacerbated here. Well, that too is a part of the Oil Spill Pollution Act process in terms of the economic impact recovery with the responsible party. The slide shows some of the bleak effects that were not terribly long-standing and forthcoming after the incident, and the BP claims center. The main thing, however, is to use this illustration, is to imagine it as a ledger sheet. This is the left side of the ledger. This all belongs under, let me back it up, the Oil Spill Pollution Act processes for the Deepwater Horizon event. Again, we're often confused with being another bullet under that process structure, and in fact we are not. On the right side of the equation, dealing with Executive Order 13554, this is where the President was focused on Gulf-wide restoration, ecosystem restoration, for the many factors that were brought up, and only a few of which there are many more, factors brought up in the presenters' presentations. And I'll name a few that stand out first and foremost. Habitat and land loss coupled. This particular case, beaten to the punch on the slides relative to both past, current, and future prospects for land loss just in this location. Again, for all the task force members, we're very, very cognizant of the level of particularly coastal habitat loss in all 5 states. This particular slide is just northwest of here. Again, the saltwater intrusion that was associated with the changing delta and changing coast. Coastal seagrasses. Seagrasses, as you know, well, and you don't, not everybody in the audience, these are some of the other spawning and nursery grounds for critical habitat, critical species, commercial and recreational, throughout the region. And they have been lost at a phenomenal scale throughout the 5 Gulf states. Then we look at just scenes from post-Katrina and the effects of climate change and climate adaptation on coasts like the Gulf Coast. This is actually a scene of barrier island chain, and just what can happen in one 8-hour span of time, much less the archaeological time demonstrated to build these islands. Then we look at water quality. Look at water quality in the nation, and again beaten to the punch by those amazing slides, but just picking out one of the evidences of how connected we are, and again, I love the speaker's presentations. We are interconnected to the entire nation. There is only but a few of the watersheds, and you have to really be bordered by the 2 mountain ranges on the east and west of the continental United States to keep us out of the game of what is transferred by water to the region. But if we looked at such issues as Gulf hypoxia, and it's actually kind of unfair to do just that here in Louisiana, because the effect of what Louisiana endures seasonally for hypoxia is actually witnessed in the vast majority of the key estuaries throughout the Gulf states. The point being that these are long-range influences that will take long-range solutions. We look at red tides, a relatively more recent phenomenon in terms of at least the impact and effect, particularly on the coastal economy and ecologies. In southeast Florida, for instance, these have gone from what used to be referred to as seasonal events to actually lasting all year long. And their intent and range is of particular concern. There were studies that were done, they're actually aged now by better than 5 or 6 years, but an occurrence of one of these blooms, when they do occur around the Gulf region, were shown to average not less than $25 billion worth of negative economic impact on the local economies. And we look at sediments. Isn't it interesting as the slides reference the amount of sediments actually withdrawn from the Mississippi River and the impact here in Louisiana? We actually have a sediment abundance issue in Alabama as a contrast to that. So you really get the effect of what a dynamic and living system it is and how diverse and independent in some cases to the geography these issues can be. But in essence have a very much a connectedness in terms of what the task force might be focused on in the future. And then last but not least, at least for this particular pictorial set, is to recognize how loved our coast is in the Gulf Coast region. And the level of participation to want to live and play here has been a little overwhelming at times for the engineering, a different type of engineering. That's engineering our wastewater and stormwater systems to be able to actually provide for the appropriate recreational water quality we might expect and actually do expect on these beautiful beaches. So, looking at fisheries. Those statistics were amazing, Garrett, as you look at the fisheries values and the fisheries concentrations down here. But they are also under siege. And if you look at it, I'll just bring up one of the evidences of decline that as you look across the years, just 92 to 2007, the spikes and wanes, there are several influences on our fisheries, not the least of which are all of the other issues that I just actually brought up. But what does this really mean to us when we look at that changing value? And we're actually going for, I think that in the 20 plus years that I've worked down here on this problem, the most compelling statement is for our future generations, the enjoyment and the effective withdrawal and ability to both recreate and commercially enjoy this resource. These just happen to be 2 of my generations in the slide, my son and my grandchildren. I was a little worried about copyright. I figured I could use my own and not How old was that fish? I didn't date the fish, but we did eat it. Tastes a lot like chicken. Then we look last at climate adaptation and sustainable communities. In this particular case, again, the region is a poster child for what the future might hold if, in effect, not properly addressed. This is a shot of Hurricane Katrina's impact, particularly after the break in the levee system in and around New Orleans. You see New Orleans in the landscape on the backdrop if your eyes are good enough. But this is, of course, not the natural state of the landscape for this particular community. And then this is a shot, again, one of mine. This is the Bay St. Louis bridge system immediately after Katrina, and most of the bridge systems, certainly from the southeast Louisiana sector all the way over to Mobile, very much like this. So to say that we have a climate adaptation challenge in front of us would be an understatement. And so what I'm trying to do, and I'll stop at this particular point in time, is put a perspective out there for the task force in particular, to recognize we work between these two worlds. And more often than not today, we work in a confused market. They consider us another dot, if you will, in the Deepwater Horizon spill response. So your staff is going to look to really work hard on that communication and try to be much more effective in making sure that all of the settings and the fora that we attend, that we separate the pack.
Thank you, Brian. Just before you move on, I want to give the task force members an opportunity to react to this framing that you put together. I think it's very helpful, not just for us as members, but of course this afternoon we'll begin our stakeholder input process. And another way I like to think about it, but I want to talk a little bit about that, is the left-hand side of the ledger, which I guess is gone. We can't show them together. But the incident side, the current law requires that polluters restore natural resource damages when there's a spill. And so that process, that natural resource damage assessment and restoration process is going on now, and the polluter has to pay. That's what the law says. So that's this side of the ledger. But there'll be some restoration that goes on as part of that. Is that how you see it? And then, on this other side of the ledger is the larger context of all these challenges that I thought the speakers this morning did such a wonderful job of framing. They didn't happen because of the spill. The spill was one more issue that exacerbates and in some ways highlights all these issues and their impact upon us. I think one of the things for the public is making sure, and I'd like to charge that our efforts here almost have to as we're seeking input, we have to make sure the public understands whether they have a concern on the left side of the ledger or the right side of the ledger. That's not their concern. We will make sure that the right people, many of whom sit on both sides of that ledger, address their particular issues. So it could be incident related, it could be related to this task force, but I think one of the strengths, and I'd love to hear reaction, is that this task force can do both, or at least ensure that we can play traffic cop to get the public's comments heard. Now, rest assured, they must be heard.
If you allow me, I'll move on to the process. Thank you for that input. So, our challenge that keeps your staff up many nights now is that October the 4th comes quickly to deliver a qualified and effectively consensus-based restoration strategy for President as set out in the executive order. Not that I'm counting, but when we look at the days in the process to actually get it into the proper draft staging, that's about 142 now, and that's calendar days, not work days. And you'll be happy to know we recognize all of them as the same. Strategy development schedule. I'm going to break it down, and I know all of you well enough to know that you know behind the simplistic model of the scheduling process is a terribly complex process. But this is about the best way that I can describe the scenario for you. If you allow me to, I'm going to walk through 3 basic steps that ultimately will get us, we believe, to that October 4th ceremony effectively. First and foremost, the executive order is rich, with a reminder upon reminder upon reminder that this is actually a working coast made up of people. And the process must actually effectively be built from the bottom up. And therefore, the first and foremost task or step ahead of us is to engage the stakeholders throughout the region in the development strategy from the ground up and from the beginning.
These things are very hard to read for every time we get them. All these slides I'm doing here are going to be on LouisianaSeafood.com's website. So if you can't read it here, I'll go through them fairly quickly. Please pull up and see what the perception study says. But basically, it's going to tell you that 70% of the people in this country still are concerned about Gulf seafood. It's going to tell you that 25% of this country doesn't want to eat it almost at all. So we've got a long way to go. And if I was a politician and had 70% of that against me, I think I'd have to pack my bags and go home. But we're never going to do that. We're going to change that perception and do our job as a seafood board to make sure that we're stronger in the future than we were today. These are some more of the same objectives. Wave one of the study, we're going to do 3 waves. Geographic differences, messaging, all the things we're going to do. And again, I apologize, it's just hard to read this, so I really want you guys to go to our website and look at it. But it's more important here what's going on with our people than it is across the country. We still have 70% of our people concerned about it in the country. What are the things they're concerned about most? They want to hear from the government. They want to hear from you guys. They want to know that seafood is safe. 29% of respondents want to know that seafood samples are continually tested to ensure safe consumption. They want to know that Gulf fishing waters are only open after we test them, open after we precautionary close them. They want to know that Gulf fishing waters are closed until adequate testing is performed. And they want to know from us that seafood is safe. From that study that we've done, these are the main things that came out of it. In our little report, we're going to give you seafood safety, frequently asked questions about dispersants, about everything you might want to know. So pull it up, get your answers from that. I don't need to go over here with you guys today, but it's there for you to see, it's there for you to check and use. Same thing there. Something else that's very important, I know Garrett hit a lot on the economic impact, but in the Gulf of Mexico, we have 120,000 jobs in the seafood industry. That's a lot of work. We have 5.6 billion it adds to the economy. Louisiana is like almost 2.1 by itself. Louisiana is about 47,000 jobs related to the seafood industry. So there's a lot that's hinged on what we do here. So everything you do here is important to Louisiana and our fishermen and our fishermen. Health benefits of seafood, again, all these will be laid out for you in our study, and I wish this was clear so you can see it. But we did a taste test, a blind taste testing, and 85% of respondents that tasted Gulf seafood said that it tasted better than the other seafood they ate. We all know that. I know Secretary Jackson's well aware of that. But we've got what we need down here. You've got to make sure you perpetuate it into the future. Health benefits of seafood. I don't have to preach that to you guys. You know the omega-3s. You know what they say about oysters, huh? So I'm going to tell you about that. But blue crabs, fish, crawfish, alligators, all these things are very, very strong down here. Very part of our vibrant economy in Louisiana, part of our tourism, part of everything we do down here is seafood. In deference to Dickie Brown's Steakhouse, they don't come here to eat steak, they come here to eat seafood. So we've got to make sure we've got enough of it for them to eat and save. That's just a quick run through. And again, I apologize if you could not read what I have up there. But I go to our website, LouisianaSeafood.com, all that will be on the website for you to see. And take your time to read, because it's more to digest than just what I just said. What I'm going to do is open the floor to Bob Dickey from FDA, let him explain what FDA has done, so we understand that. Then we'll bring up Buck Sutter, and I'll come back and close. Bob?
If the audience wouldn't mind, I just want to give a couple of words on Mr. Dickey. First, thank you. Thank you very much, and we'll wait till the end in case you guys ask us any questions or comments on your presentation. Mr. Dickey is, Dr. Dickey, excuse me, is director of the FDA Gulf Seafood Laboratory in Dauphin Island, Alabama. He has conducted research in marine biology and seafood safety for 30 years, and he's been a resident of the Gulf Coast for 20 of those 30 years. We heard from the Seafood Association, who of course is concerned about the economic impacts on their members from the BP incident as well, but we also know that this is about the larger issue of seafood safety. eager to hear the science. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, for the opportunity to update you on the status of seafood safety in the aftermath of Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I would like to say at the outset that the FDA role and responsibility for seafood safety is our entire motivation is public health and safety. It is centered around that, and everything else takes a second place to our assurance or our ability to assure the safety of food products that are brought on the market in the United States. Our standard is science, and in this case, because of the Deepwater, the intensity of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the scientific standard is put under a high degree of duress in order to get things moving and operating rapidly and on time to have an impact on not only the public health of the Gulf Coast, but the region as a whole. I'd like to give a brief overview of what I hope to cover today. I'm going to cover preventive measures, perhaps more appropriately proactive measures that were taken to ensure the safety of seafood that was entering market channels, even as oil was spewing into the Gulf of Mexico. Our reopening protocol, I'll go over a few highlights of that for hopefully better understanding of how it was put together and what it means. Our seafood safety criteria and methods that were used in the assessment of the safety of seafood throughout this process. I'll go over the testing for reopening and the results that we obtained during the reopening process during that period, and explain a little bit about the extended surveillance testing and the results that are ongoing yet today. Finally, I'll close with our federal and state interagency coordination to give you some idea of the coordination that was required not only to get this program off the ground, but with give you some feeling for the amount of cooperation and collaboration that took place in the entire process. So, covering preventive measures first. After the explosion and sinking of the Deepwater Horizon well rig, of course, oil was moving into the Gulf. The first thing that has to happen is to close oil spill impacted waters and any waters that are expected to be impacted. And this was done in very close, actually it was done by NOAA. They hold the responsibility for fisheries in federal waters, and we're on scene on the water with the Coast Guard, ensuring that areas impacted by the oil are closed to recreational or commercial fishing and to commercial or recreational watercraft for that matter. That was to prevent the entry of tainted seafood product onto the market, and also to protect the health of the boat people, boaters that would be out on the water. In addition to these two preemptive measures, performance of what we call HACCP inspections, hazard analysis critical control point inspections of primary seafood processors and wholesalers across the Gulf Coast were conducted. These businesses were visited and their HACCP plans were inspected, and they were briefed on what was necessary for them to do to prevent the entry of tainted product onto market channels. Reopening protocol, after conducting and assuring that we were comfortable that the industry was fully aware of potential product that might come into their businesses, and to be aware not to let it distribute to market channels. The federal agencies and state agencies involved in the response to the Gulf oil spill got together and developed a consensus protocol on exactly how we would go about assessing whether waters were ready to be reopened, and what criteria would be used to determine and assess the safety of seafood that was being brought in to determine whether waters were ready to be opened. This was a EPA, NOAA, FDA, USGS collaboration. It began in May, and actually we actually had the first calls in April. Completed really the final draft of the protocol in mid-May, and then began implementing that protocol as water started to clear, and the states called for testing to determine whether seafood from areas that were not impacted by oil or were lightly impacted by oil were ready for assessment or analysis and testing. This is the criteria of the table, the levels of concern that were established by the interagency, state and federal group that put together the criteria for analysis of seafood samples. You can see that we have 5 non-cancer polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that were selected and 7 cancer-causing polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that were selected for monitoring in seafood and seafood species and samples that were collected from the Gulf. During the reopening process, or the determination whether waters could be reopened, FDA tested seafood that was sampled from state waters. That's 3 miles out from Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and 9 miles out from the state of Florida. NOAA tested seafood from federal waters and had their ships, and also commercial contractors out collecting samples for them outside of the 3 to 9 mile limits of the territorial state waters. All seafood was tested using 2 different methods. The initial screening method was organoleptic assessment, aka the sniff test that is been mentioned so frequently in the press, and 2, instrumental analysis. The organoleptic assessment was a very important screening measure for us. It had actually improved graded the efficiency of our sample throughput and analyses by eliminating those samples that were obviously tainted and needed no further examination. Those waters remained closed where samples were found to be organoleptically tainted. The instrumental analyses required the operation or the extraction and detailed analysis of seafood specimens using sophisticated liquid chromatography and mass spectrometric methods for those polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in the little concern table that I showed you in the previous slide. The method details, the specific methods and the method details can be viewed at FDA.gov. Follow the links to both of Mexico oil spill update. I won't take too much of your time now explaining scientific technologies. Testing the reopened waters for fishing took place from June through November 2010. 2,800 specimens were collected from state waters and tested by organoleptic and instrumental analysis. And NOAA collected 5,300 or 5,400 specimens from federal waters and tested by the same 2-step procedure to assure the safety of the samples. 20% of samples tested by NOAA were verified by repeat analysis, not because we saw anything, but because we wanted to be sure that the results coming out of our laboratories were reliable and verifiable. So we sent them to other FDA and NOAA laboratories for assessment or for repeat analysis. 50% of the specimens were subjected to testing for dispersant chemicals, primarily DOS, dialkylsodium sulfosuccinate, is the major principal component of Corex at 9500. The results from testing for reopening waters to fishing, that period of June to November 2010, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon levels in all test samples were found to be 100 to 1,000-fold below levels of concern that were adopted by all states and 3 agencies. The dispersant, specifically the DOS, the dialkylsodium sulfosuccinate compound that we used as a marker for the dispersant in seafood tissues, all samples tested were found to be below levels of detection, and for a few of the samples that where we did find DOS, it was greater than 1,000 times below the levels of concern, and those levels of concern are, of course, 100 ppm for fin fish and 500 ppm for crabs and shrimp and oysters. The results, again, are available at FDA.gov. They are in spreadsheet form. You have to exercise a bit of patience to take a look at the column headings and understand exactly what is being analyzed for and what the results show in the individual cells for results. Extended surveillance. Even before we had finished conducting our reopening sampling, FDA established a program, a plan for 2-year continued surveillance of seafood coming from the Gulf waters, carried out from October 1, 2010, and to be continued through October 1, 2012. Sample collection will occur from 118 primary processors and wholesalers across the Gulf Coast, from Louisiana to Florida. We will collect 42 seafood specimens targeted from each firm. That totals 4,900 or so total oysters, crabs, and shrimp will be targeted for collection and analysis. These numbers will vary due to seasonal availability of those products. I mentioned that pinfish were excluded from the FDA collections for 2 primary reasons. We know that pinfish, if PAHs or oil constituents are taken up by fish, they are rapidly metabolized and excreted. We focused on oysters, crabs, and shrimp because they tend to retain it a bit longer, and it would be the better sensible for us to be alarmed, to be alerted if there were any issues involving tainted seafood in the Gulf in this period of continued or extended sampling and surveillance. Extended surveillance testing completed to date as of February 23, actually. FDA has visited 106 seafood primary processors and wholesalers, inspected those institutions or those businesses for hazard plans as well as collect samples. 1,400 seafood specimens have been collected, averaging about 281 specimens tested per month thus far. Results from extended surveillance testing to date, again to February 23, are identical to those from the reopening sample analysis. PAH levels are 100 to 1,000 below levels of concern. Dispersant is also either not detectable or 1,000 times below levels of concern. Federal state interagency coordination and cooperation continues to this day. As I mentioned, as we began this process and responding to the oil spill, I remember I was in Washington on detail at the time that the Deepwater Horizon exploded. Within 5 days, we had established an ad hoc group within the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition to begin planning for our response. We knew what was coming because we've been through oil spill response scenarios before, dating back to the Exxon Valdez. State interagency coordination and cooperation with our primary partners, primarily National Marine Fisheries Service, from NOAA, EPA, and the state departments of public health and fisheries and wildlife, was continuous pretty much from the beginning of May through the entire reopening process. We were in constant coordination and contact and communication. The states and NIMS continue to test for PAHs and dispersants as we do. We've come to agreement and cooperation on our uniformity of methods, not only for collection but for analysis. And we will continue, FDA will continue this, our surveillance testing for a 2-year period. The need for continued testing after October 2012 will be determined at that time, and will be dependent upon a review, an in-depth review of the results that we got that we've accumulated in this 2-year period. And that really concludes my summary statement on the status of seafood safety. I think it's important for everyone to understand that fish and shellfish harvested in areas that have been reopened or were unaffected by Deepwater Horizon are considered by FDA to be considered safe to eat.
Thank you, Dr. Dickey. If you could stick around, we're going to hear from Buck Sutter first, and then if there are any questions from the task force members, we'll address them. I know I have.
Madam Chairman, thank you very much. I just want to make a few comments on behalf of NOAA, but really in terms of how this is can be a microcosm of what is the job of course now with the task force. NOAA, of course, impact and seafood safety is right at the very core of what our agency is all about. We mobilized our resources almost immediately following the spill in regards to seafood safety. Whether you're working for the Southeast Regional Office for Fisheries Service in St. St. Petersburg, or our science lab in Pascagoula, Mississippi, or some of the chemistry work that was done in Seattle or in Woods Hole. It was really an exemplary show of how dedicated folks were all around our agency. And were willing to throw in whether it was a holiday, an evening, or weekend. And even though at one point we had closed up to nearly 89,000 square miles of the federal waters, nearly 37%, it was done always with an abundance of caution. And I think that was a key factor in all of the procedures that Dr. Dickey just went through. And I think the other thing, but really the important factor I think here is this, none of it was a coordination across. There was a blurring of, it didn't really matter if you work for EPA or FDA or, as a matter of fact, Bob and I did a whole series of these dockside chats that were kind of set the stage for a lot of the work that we're doing now. And the fact that it was, we did these shoulder to shoulder with folks from the states and with the stakeholders. And not only were we providing information, but we were getting information back. And it was this synergistic relationship between the state agencies and the federal agencies and different academics and stakeholders really is the foundation of what we're going to build this whole stakeholder strategy on. And I think we learned some lessons that are certainly that we'll be able to transfer, but that enablement of building on the past success and building on these relationships is really what it's going to go. Really what it boils down to for a successful task force strategy. So anyway, I wanted to just to make that one quick point and pass it back to you.
Thank you for your comments. I'm sure there are questions for Dr. Dickey, then you want to take them now. I'd like to close with your comments. Okay?
No, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. All right. Basically, in Louisiana, we're beginning to create a protocol of branding and quality assurance programs. We're going to be working on professionalization, traceability, sustainability, but the cornerstone of all that will be testing protocols in the future. We need to develop a Gulf seafood protocol that continues the testing by the government, both state and federal, into the future. We need to understand what's happening in our environment before we have a major problem. We need to know what's going on now, so if there is a problem, we can solve it. But not only that, so that we can guarantee the rest of this world and country that we have the safest seafood in the world here in the Gulf. So it's very important that we learn our lessons from what's going on and not stop, but continue our growth into the future. So I would hope that this task force would get all the regulatory agencies, EPA, FDA, NOAA, together to create that protocol to make it happen. Also, I think that we need to have a regulatory summit of sorts to where we revisit all the protocols that are used for seafood testing and safety and bring them into this age, bring them into the electronic age. Right now, if you want to sign a lease for the Gulf of Mexico for oil drilling, you can't kill the walruses, seals, and sea otters. We don't have any of those. We need to go look at all these boilerplate thought processes and change them. Not only bring them into what really happening today, but bring them to where they work electronically at the speed of business rather than the speed of government. We need to really sit down and evaluate what we've always done, because a lot of times we don't see the forest for the trees. So the agency need to get that taken care of. And when I met with John a couple of weeks ago, I told him this, is that when anyone asks you, how do you predict the future? The only way to predict the future is to create it. And you have the unique opportunity to create the future for Louisiana and the Gulf right now. What this task force does tells us where we're going to be in the future, from land loss to our fisheries to everything that we're doing right now. So you have a major job on your hands. And I don't want anybody asking me how to predict the future. You guys create it for us and create it the right way. And that's what I'm looking for from this task force for our industry and for the state and for this Gulf. I thank you for the opportunity to come up here and talk to you. I'm glad you heard from NOAA and FDA about food safety. I will always be here working hard for Louisiana and the fishery, but I need your help to bring it into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Harlan. Thank you, Bob Sutter. I do have a question. I'll start, and then I'm going to open it up if anybody has any questions. what I liked about the presentation is that it was forward-looking. Obviously, there's, again, the response, the left side of the ledger, but for this task force, what does it mean going forward? And I'm intrigued by this idea, and Harlan, you and I have talked about it, of sort of the Gulf Coast seafood testing protocol being its own deliverable, if you will, something that shows the seafood safe. So I guess my question is for Dr. Kiki or Bucksetter, but are you aware anywhere else that this level of rigor is being applied to seafood testing, and if so, where?
Thank you for the question. That's a good one. I am not aware of anywhere else that has undergone this level of testing. Of course, our international trade partners, they have quality control programs and systems in place where they can monitor, for example, their fisheries, primarily the aquaculture fisheries. We have to keep in mind 84%, 85% of the seafood consumed in this country is imported, and half of that is aquaculture, leaving 15 roughly percent that is domestic. Part of that's aquaculture, and the other part's wild capture. So it's in both cases, FDA has been calling upon industry, both wild capture and aquaculture, to do a better job of monitoring their product so that we don't have to stop them at the border or at the port. Aquaculture drugs are an issue. Marine biotoxins are an issue. Pathogenic bacteria are an issue in our environment. Petrochemicals are now an issue in the Gulf of Mexico. And so, to get back to your original question, I think this is the most intense testing that I've ever heard of seafood coming out of any wild capture fishery or aquaculture fishery for that matter. I would say that the FDA has conducted joint training with every one of the Gulf Coast states, from Texas to Florida, on methods that they plan to institute and install in their state laboratories so they can continue this process. And this is a good foundation for perhaps what Harlan was talking about, in instituting a standard or a permanent program for the monitoring and surveillance of product, not only coming out of the Gulf, but coming out of our aquaculture fields as well. So I hope that answers your question.
I just wanted to add one point to that, and that is that not only is the seafood process of sampling in regards to Deepwater Horizon following the same protocol that together with FDA, but the sampling also is still ongoing. So even though the spill has been stopped for quite a few months now, the sampling both at dockside and at sea is still an ongoing protocol. And so I think that's an important factor that is in support of the industry, to make sure that people know that this is, in fact, an ongoing issue, and will be for quite some time, to make sure that we're following these things in a scientifically supportable manner.
Dr. Dickey, I just had a question about your statement that the data is available on the website, but it's in spreadsheets and rather cumbersome to dig through. I wondered if these conclusions that you've drawn and shared with us today are also available on that website, because they certainly are informative and give a lot of assurance about the quality of Gulf seafood.
The summarization that I put together for today for this presentation is not on the website.
October the 5th, the President signed something into effect, and the world went into action on October the 6th. Oh, could it be that easy? It took a few months to get some footing under us. So in Pensacola, however, we met for the first time, and there were in excess of 300 participants in the Pensacola, the first task force meeting in Pensacola. And these are my terms, but that was a mining opportunity. The earliest opportunity for 300 plus to tell us specifically the answers to 4 questions, which we'll get a report on a little later in more detail. How could we best engage effectively their involvement, given the task force membership was set, but this broad stakeholder responsibility was on the table? So we consider that our starts, because that actually was the beginning of the sketch of a blueprint for how the process would begin to unfold in the stakeholder involvement phase. In the latter stages that have occurred, and you will be the recipient of for your approval here in just a few minutes from the engagement team, we have built out a rich set of engagement activities to do just precisely that. And we'll look for your guidance as to how to either increase or polish that stone. But effectively what I want to point out to you here is nothing happens without the stakeholder engagement in this particular process. In developing the strategy, the second step was that the President's executive order made us very mindful that about the last thing we better attempt to do is bring something new to the table just for the sake of bringing something new to the table. In essence, this region, as was pointed out by the previous presenter, is rich with activities that have been going on, some for 30 and 40 years, to get at the very same problems that are in the crosshairs for the task force's consideration. We looked at that a little bit dynamically. This is just 35 of the cover slides of those particular of 35 plans, for which there could have been 135 thrown up here on this screen. When we went in, however, particularly looking at this being the larger planning efforts, at least regional, certainly basin level, estuary level, they started to tell a story. Now, on the resource focus side, I mean, what brought these communities together to actually get into the planning and restoration focus was largely the resource of concern. The resource that was at risk, the resource was in decline, maybe the resource was actually just going away. Notably, all of these plans to mobilize that kind of interest are first and foremost focused on communities. That's the community of practice, the community of the people that are the drivers. Beneath that, we see different communities. Those in Southeast Louisiana, represented by many of the leaders in the back of the room, represent largely fishing communities, while others may be more industrialized sectors in Houston, tourism sectors in Florida. So you have a rich association of responsibilities and focuses here, but they still come back to the people. Beneath that, we start to see the teasing out of the real concern. The concerns here that I used to live, or I used to fish, or I used to hunt out here, and now the land no longer exists. Those come pretty much to the forefront. I used to catch more of a species of fish. I used to take my grandchildren, and that's not happening. So you kind of see the list, and this is a concatenated list because those were many plans, there's many plans to come. We're pretty certain that most of the plans would come back to these same resource focuses. The second one is to look at what was stress, what was the driver, what was causing this particular problem in the first place. Water quality, contaminants, sediments, pathogens, salinity, overfishing. The real important feature here is none of these stand alone. All of these have an interrelated association to one another, and we'll try to point that out a little more clearly in a moment. But this was a huge wealth of knowledge to pay homage directly to that guidance in the executive order and really get in and look underneath the tent flap and see what's going on. So this is what we refer to as our step 2. That is to come out of the gate here today with you informed, beginning the informed process, both with you and with the public, to figure out, just like the system is living and dynamic, so are the people in it. And these plans are very, very important, but today is today, and we have to have a good start. So as we look at that, that was a shorter period of time. It's a review step of the current work to actually establish what we hear about in the engagement framework is on the table right now. It gave us that first footing, and that's what we hope to start today with the engagement sessions that will lead into this evening. Again, with and through the communities of the stakeholder interests. The third step gets a little dicier. It's to be a little more heavy lifting. That is also like the communities of focus here. The federal, state, governmental families are also a living organism. And today's capacity is different than yesterday's and very different than tomorrow's. And so as a consequence to looking at this as a credible approach, we need to figure out where that is today. To drive a strategy that brings to bear challenging but doable capacities to get this ball rolling well and well understood on October 4th. As we look at that, we refer to that as our step 3 process. That schedule will lay out a very, very aggressive dynamic for us with your approval here in a few minutes, I hope, I'm not sure what the second plan B would be. But in step 3, what we would propose to do for you, the task force and the public, is actually to establish the first discussion draft, this first discussion development document of this scenario that will give both you and the public an understanding of what we can gravitate towards, we think, most readily, most quickly, and most effectively. And we would release that at your very next task force meeting, approximately 2 months from now. And that would be synthesized with input through the stakeholder community-driven processes that you'll hear more about here in a few minutes, to get to a final strategy development towards the end of the summer, and ultimately in the hands of the president. So that is a very, very simplistic overview, but one can only imagine how much work that is for staff. So if I've made any sense of this, it's a merger of three steps that, in effect, carried out properly, will actually reveal the commonalities, reveal the consensus priorities and capacities that we can bring to bear on this problem right now. And in that particular regard, again, our words are Madam Chair and Vice Chair, and I think you hit on this in your presentation, Garrett. The last thing we can afford to do is bring another piece of coffee table shelf art to the table. Cannot do that. So this is where the rubber is going to meet the road on taking the first and foremost measured steps in some critical areas to demonstrate our capacity and will to move ahead. And then finally, so in that particular respect, the strategy will focus on that overlap, that concentricity of relationships, approaches, needs, values, etc.
Thank you, Brian. And thanks to Bob Sutter as well, who I know has been working with you on this process. What I'd like to do, if it's consistent with what you're thinking, is have Christy give the presentation on stakeholder input, and then we'll take a break, just quickly cover the break, and come back and have a little discussion of both your presentation and hers.
That would be perfect.
Sorry, it looks like it's Jay Harper. Thank you. Thanks.
Morning, Madam Chairwoman. My name is Jay Harper. I'm with the Department of Homeland Security. I'm currently on loan with the task force, and I'm also a Louisiana native, so I'm excited to be a part of this. As Brian mentioned, nothing will happen with this, with respect to what the task force does, what we publish, what we act on, without stakeholder input. And on October 4th, the report that we submit will certainly have run the traps of stakeholder input across the goals. So, the task force that was stood up by executive order is directed by the President to engage stakeholders to ensure that they have a role in the development of the strategy. And the engagement strategy that I'll be talking about today is just kind of how it stands now. We certainly hope to make it more robust as we work our way across the Gulf. And we look forward to your comments and or questions about how this is going to function as we go forward. So based on the input we received from the first task force meeting in Pensacola, we've identified various opportunities for stakeholder engagement to include listening sessions, our website, our state information call lines, our listserv, and our stakeholder calls. First one I'll talk about is our listening sessions, which will kick off this afternoon here in New Orleans. We're hoping to hold 10 listening sessions over the next 6 months, 2 in each Gulf state throughout the strategy development process. And to do that, we've identified 4 key stakeholder groups that we feel is reasonably inclusive of the stakeholders across the Gulf Coast: public and NGOs, academia, local governments, business and industry. And we're hoping that these listening sessions will be an interactive discussion for stakeholders to include their comments, their questions, their input in the discussion draft that Brian spoke about earlier. So in addition to that, we're working on our website right now. It's currently under construction. We've got a good lead on it right now. It's coming along better and better every day. We hope to use that to post our meeting schedules, our agendas, our your bios, and various other pieces of information that the public may find useful as they try and learn more about what the task force is set up to do. We're going to have a listening session schedule up there, along with updates on the task force activities across the Gulf. We also currently have our frequently asked questions posted up there, and that will help people navigate and structure their questions and their comments for valuable inclusion in the task force strategy. Our contact information for stakeholders to provide input is also listed on the website, and Keela Hughes will extrapolate on that a little further. The website is on restorethegulf.gov/task force, and we have an email address on there, Gulf Coast Task Force at EPA.gov, for stakeholders that maybe can't make it to any of the meetings or any of the public sessions to provide their input. Can be emailed to us for inclusion into the final strategy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Keela, who will discuss a little bit about the State Information Law.
Good morning, Madam Chairperson. My name is Keela Hughes, and I'm from the Department of Homeland Security as well. I'm a lifelong resident of Louisiana, and I'm on loan and very excited to be here this morning. One of the methods of engaging our stakeholders was to establish a state information call line, and we do expect that to go live on March 2nd. We encourage the general public to call the 800 number to receive information about meeting updates, times, locations, and agendas. Should there be questions, we do have representatives from a lot of your agencies at the head table who are geographically located in the 5 states, and the caller can choose to be transferred to speak to one of the representatives in those states. Our listserv, we've been working on our listserv. We've compiled about 2,000 contacts. We've sent out information about this meeting, about agendas and upcoming conference calls that we're having. If you'd like to be included in our listserv, you can email us at gulfcoasttaskforce@epa.gov. The general public, if you see Jay, myself, or Christy around, when you grab us today, we will also add you to our listserv. We're monitoring this account. We're responding to questions from the general public on information, and we also welcome any comments from the general public. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Christy Watkins. She's going to talk about our stakeholder calls.
Thank you. My name is Christy Watkins, and I'm part of the Communications and Engagement team for the task force, and I'm on loan from the Department of the Interior's Fish and Wildlife Service. So with the stakeholder calls, that's an opportunity for those folks that cannot make it out to the meetings to hear updates from John as Executive Director. Also provides them an opportunity to ask questions. We kicked these off initially before the Pensacola meeting in November, and we recently held 2 prior to this meeting. We tried to schedule them in the afternoon and the evening hours to be cognizant of people's work schedules. So we plan to do these before every task force meeting. There's 3 remaining meetings, so we'll be doing these stakeholders calls in advance of each of these meetings. And we'll be sending notifications out about these upcoming calls through the listserv, and also have it posted on the website as well. So what you've heard so far is an indication of what we've proposed in our strategy as part of the task force staff. What I'm going to talk about now is some existing networks that we're using as yet another avenue to reach out to stakeholders to try to get as much input into this process as possible. Each of you probably has federal advisory committees within your agency, and we're excited to work with you and talk to you about how some of those may be appropriately used as methods of stakeholder input with us. For EPA, they have done work through their federal advisory committee, starting with the Local Government Advisory Committee. And this group represents local governments from around the country. They have developed a Gulf Coast restoration work group that will be working together to provide recommendations on input they get from their local communities to give to Administrator Jackson, who will then in turn present it to you all as task force members for consideration in the development of the strategy. And I believe Mayor Randy Roach of Lake Charles is serving as the work group chair. And is Mayor Roach in the audience? So the work group is currently made up of 7 members of the Local Government Advisory Committee, as well as 15 non-members of the committee, but those 15 folks are representing all of the affected Gulf states. They had a meeting, a work group meeting recently here in New Orleans on February 17th, and they had a public comment period. They were addressing discussions or questions around the best ways that local governments can get engaged into this process. So we look forward to hearing their input as they go before the full advisory committee and submit those recommendations to Administrator Jackson. The second group is the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. They also are doing a similar process to the Local Government Advisory Committee, and they are forming a 9 to 11 member work group to develop recommendations from input in the local communities. And again, they have the contacts to get out there and make sure that all the voices are heard. And I believe Latasha Brown is the work group co-chair, and I'd like to recognize her now. Thank you. They are going to be having periodic meetings to try to gather this input. They have had an environmental justice roundtable before the Pensacola meeting. They also had an environmental justice roundtable yesterday afternoon from some of the folks of the local communities around here that gave their input. So to sort of tie all this back together, as Brian mentioned, in the Pensacola meeting, we had the first listening session that was structured around these 4 questions. We were asking folks how they would best like to hear from us, how we could make sure that their voices were heard. So what came out of that is there were more than 300 participants in that first listening session in Pensacola. These are some of the key things that they said that they would like to see and would allow them to be able to interact and make sure that we...
presenters previously for getting us there. It's also an awesome prospect to follow John Berry, Charles Allen, and Garrett Graves as the next speaker, but I'll give it my best shot. I want to thank both the chairs and the members for giving us an opportunity. I'm actually going to represent the voice of the larger staff, your executive staff that's been working for the last few months to prepare for this meeting and prepare a schema, if you will, to move ahead with the task that's before the task force, and that's the preparation of an effective and stakeholder-driven strategy for progress, the very progress that was referenced numerous times in the previous presenters' presentations. I'll move right in. This is as high as the stakes get. I think the previous presenters more than overwhelmed the situation and informed the dialogue there. This is a process that we must get right because, again, the stakes are so very, very high for both the region and the nation. So it is a national treasure of unprecedented consequence, and it is America's seed. Looking specifically to the executive order for our guidance at the staff level, we bore in to many of the aspects that were presented in that particular guidance, and we focus once again on the President's acknowledgement of what a national treasure that we are dealing with. And frankly, we'll get into a little bit in the work planning structure, just what that means in terms of stepping up to the plate and doing something just a little different in the legislative and the executive branch. First, in incident recovery, and this would be virtually any incidents that would affect the Oil Spill Pollution Act of 1990. This is an incident that we in the nation have come to know as the Deepwater Horizon, or in many circles just DWH. You see it almost on all of the correspondence. But it is an incident of specific time, scale, and value. On the executive side of the House is, of course, Executive Order 13554, the President's executive order signed into effect on October the 5th. This is where we're focused on ecosystem restoration. And I'm going to try to bridge the two, and there is a reason that the line connects this, because there is a bridge between the two, but they are in in two worlds. On the incident recovery side, and by the way, just before I get away from this, I think you can appreciate from John Barry's presentation, this is what the view of the Gulf would look like if we drained the water out of it. And if you look just basically the southeast of New Orleans in the slide, you see those fingers, that more or less that mountain range that cascades off of the continental shelf. That was the previous deposits of the upper Midwest delivery of sediments, and actually is still ongoing, of course. But those are just archaeological evidences of how the river worked. I'd also point out, if we have anybody in here from Iowa, Nebraska, etc., they probably have a land claim out there, but that's related. The Deepwater Horizon spill response that we're also focused on.
I'd like to thank Mr. Barry, Mr. Allen, Vice Chairman Graves for those wonderful presentations. They really set context. We're going to move right into the next topic, but I do want to stop for just a second to see if any of the members of the task force seated up front have any questions for any of the presenters.
Madam Chair, not a question, but just a comment. So much incredible, important information by three certainly distinguished and knowledgeable people. May we have a copy of their comments and a PowerPoint, lots of facts and figures I'd like to digest a little bit more.
Absolutely. Good suggestion. Of course you can. And I will just remind everyone that every state's going to get their chance. So we recognize that every state has similar, but maybe some different issues as well. But it is part of our reason for being here, instead of in Washington or our respective state capitals, is to hear from the people here what has already been identified as challenges and opportunity. And I think our three speakers did a wonderful job of doing that. We now turn to Brian Griffith. Many of you know Brian is head of the Gulf Coast Alliance. We have gently borrowed him, probably permanently, to serve as the Deputy Director of the Gulf Coast Restoration Task Force staff. And Brian is going to walk us through the structure, schedule, and progress in terms of moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, we are back on time. I want to thank the just a couple of months away from for many of us, we focus on a couple months away from the anniversary. Again, was the effect of an incident to actually turn the Oil Spill Pollution Act processes on. And centered around that incident is and was and still is a lot of ongoing activity to clean up and to deal with the specific first task of the emergency response: cap the well, get the exposure under control. The second feature of that within that structure is what the world has started to refer to, and I will try not to do that. I'll try not to use the acronym, but rather the title line is the Natural Resources Damage Assessment. And just precisely what that term means is, what are the damages associated with the Deepwater Horizon spill incident, the event itself? And that is an ongoing proposition and process that is taking place among all of the trustees' council. In effect, of course, it is to look at the damages that are or have occurred or will occur as a result of that spill. Be they the inundation here, this is actually just, I believe this is Blackman's Parish, to the impact on the living marine system, to the impact on waterfowl, and the impacts and the impacts and the impacts, and photos of the slides could go on. This is where the process is different than has been in the past. One of the things I would actually ask your indulgence on is to point out even the presenters, as they did such a marvelous job, they moved back and forth in the dialogue between restoration and largely on a ecosystem scale, and largely that level of effort that is going on to recover specifically from the Deepwater Horizon incident. So as your staff has been working on this particular puzzle for you, we engage that confusion a little bit daily. And I want to try to put a perspective out there for you and get your concurrence, of course, and your guidance as to how to best help in this particular respect broadly. But you'll note that the executive order specifies specifically the Deepwater Horizon event and then moves into addressing long-standing ecological decline. Of course, for those of us that do this as a daily walk of our life, we know those are two distinctly, largely, but not exclusively separable incidences, that being one an incident and the other being the occasion's effect of a long-standing level of decline, notwithstanding notably the level of land loss right here in southeast Louisiana or Louisiana proper. So I'm going to take just a moment of time to try to give you a reflection on how I think we ought to begin to collectively address this confusion. There are two pieces of work at play here simultaneously.